She was 15 years old the morning her uncle by marriage, Elias Pruitt, set her trunk on the porch of the only home she had ever known and told her the Calloway place belonged to him now, signed and sealed, and that she was welcome to walk to town before the frost came in. She had $11.40 sewn into the lining of her coat, a coat that had been her mother's, and a Bible with a broken spine that no one else had wanted. Behind her, smoke still seemed to hang faintly in the rafters of the barn where her parents had died the winter before, though the fire itself had long since gone cold. And ahead of her lay 40 miles of Kansas prairie and a town called Millhaven Bend that she had visited only twice in her life. She did not know yet that 3 weeks later, with the last of her coat money, she would buy a crumbling windmill on an abandoned homestead at the edge of that town for the astonishing, almost laughable sum of $3.20, a purchase the whole county would call the folly of an orphan girl with more grief than sense. She did not know that inside the seized-up, wasp-nested loft of that windmill was a secret that had waited 11 years to be found, one that would not only restore what had been stolen from her, but would answer a question she had never dared to ask her mother while she lived: why there had never been any family to speak of, no grandparents, no aunts, no cousins, as though Martha Calloway had fallen to earth alone. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Rosalind Calloway. He used to stand Rosalind on a stump when she was small, no older than 4 or 5, and point to the way the tall grass rippled in long silver waves under a sky that seemed to have no edges, and he would say, "Listen to it, Rosie, that is a fortune passing by for free, and someday I will build something that can catch it." Her mother, Martha, was a smaller, quieter presence, dark-haired where Thomas was fair, with hands that were always moving, always mending, always shaping dough or darning wool or braiding Rosalind's hair before dawn so there would be time enough after for chores. Martha spoke little of her own girlhood. When Rosalind asked, as children do, about grandmothers and grandfathers, Martha's answer was always some version of the same gentle deflection. "My people are gone now, sweetheart, and this is our family, right here, the 3 of us, and that has always been enough." Rosalind, being young, accepted this the way children accept the shape of the sky, without questioning why it should be so. The Calloway homestead was not large, but it was well loved, and Thomas was known throughout the township of Ashwell County as a man whose word could be trusted further than most men's signatures. He hauled lumber for neighbors without asking payment when a barn burned, and Martha nursed half the babies born within 10 miles during the diphtheria scare of 1879, boiling rags, and sitting up nights with families who were near strangers to her. Rosalind grew up watching her parents give freely of what little they had, and she absorbed without being taught the particular frontier creed that a person's worth was measured not in what they owned, but in what they were willing to share. She learned to bake bread that could feed a threshing crew from a mother who never once complained of tired arms, and she learned from her father how to read the sky for hail, how to gauge a good well by the color of the grass around it, how to mend harness leather and reset a wagon wheel, and calm a spooked horse with nothing more than a low, steady voice. By the time she was 10, she could do the work of a hired hand, and by 12 she had begun keeping the household ledger in a neat, careful hand because her mother's eyes had begun to trouble her in lamplight. There were, in those years, moments that would return to Rosalind again and again in the seasons of trial that followed, small scenes she would turn over like smooth stones in her pocket. She remembered a night in her 9th year when a terrible dust storm rolled in from the west, blotting out the sun at 4 in the afternoon and turning the whole sky the color of a fresh bruise, and her father had gathered her and her mother into the root cellar and told stories by lamplight until the wind stopped screaming, stories about the mills of his own childhood in Ohio, about the great turning wheels that ground wheat into flour fine as snow, about how a mill, properly built, could outlast the men who raised it and feed generations who never knew their names. She remembered, too, a particular Sunday when a traveling photographer passed through Millhaven Bend and her father spent nearly a full week's egg money to have the 3 of them photographed together in their good clothes, because, he said, a family ought to have proof of itself somewhere in the world. Rosalind kept that photograph in her coat pocket during everything that came after, and it would prove, in time, to be far more important than her father could have guessed. She also remembered the neighbors who shaped her sense of what community meant, people whose names would echo through the rest of her story. There was Mabel Ostrander, who ran the dry goods store in Millhaven Bend, and who had once given 8-year-old Rosalind a peppermint stick simply because the girl had walked 12 miles with her father to fetch nails and looked, in Mabel's words, thin as a fence rail and twice as solemn. There was Reverend Caleb Sooner, a circuit preacher with a limp from an old war wound, who baptized Rosalind in the shallows of Antelope Creek and who would, years later, be among the very few in town willing to stand against powerful men on her behalf. There was Sarah Tillman, the baker's daughter, a year older than Rosalind, whose friendship began over a shared bucket at a well digging and who would remain loyal through every reversal of Rosalind's fortune. And there was Elias Pruitt, her mother's cousin by marriage, a lean, calculating man who farmed a much larger and more prosperous section to the east, who visited perhaps twice a year, always looking with a flat, assessing gaze at the Callaway land as though counting its worth in bushels and board feet. Rosalind did not like him even as a small child, though she could not have said why. There was something in the way his eyes moved over a room, cataloging rather than seeing. There was another memory, one Rosalind would return to more than any other in the years that followed, of the autumn her father took her along on the long wagon trip to Millhaven Bend to sell a load of broomcorn. The only time in her childhood she had ever seen the town before circumstance forced her to make it her home. She remembered how small and self-important the courthouse square had seemed to her then, how the smell of the bakery had made her mouth water from 2 streets away, and how her father, unloading sacks at the grain merchant's dock, had paused for a long moment to look northward, out past the last houses toward a rise of ground where, though she did not know it then and would not learn it for another 6 years, her own grandfather's windmill still stood turning in the wind. She had asked him why he was staring, and he had only shaken his head and said that something about the light out that way reminded him of a story his own father had once told him, though he could not, at the time, say quite what story that had been, a small strange moment of nearly remembered inheritance that Rosalind would only understand much later was no coincidence at all, for Thomas Callaway had courted Martha Houseman, unknowingly, in the very shadow of the family she had been forced to leave behind, though neither of them, so far as Rosalind ever learned, had realized how close that shadow still lay. There was also the winter of the great blizzard, when Rosalind was 11. 3 days of white wind so total that her father strung a rope from the house to the barn so no one would lose their way between the two, and during which Martha had taught her, huddled close by the stove with wool blankets over both their laps. The particular stitch her own mother had once shown her for mending torn canvas, a stitch Martha called, without explanation, the miller's knot, a name that meant nothing to Rosalind then, but would return to her with a jolt of recognition years later, standing in a dusty loft above a set of silent grindstones, when she found that very same stitch worked into the binding of an old ledger's spine. Her father's dream, the one he spoke of most often, was to build a windmill of his own on their land, not merely for water but for grinding, a small local mill that could serve homesteaders too far from the county seat to haul their grain any real distance. He had begun to save toward it, board by board, nail by nail, storing lumber in the barn loft, sketching plans on the backs of old letters. He never lived to raise it. In the winter of Rosalind's 14th year, a lantern was overturned in that same barn during a terrible ice storm. Whether by a startled horse or a gust through a warped door no one ever determined with certainty, and the fire that followed took the barn, took most of the stored lumber, and took, in the smoke and the panic of trying to free the animals, both Thomas and Martha Callaway, who went in together and did not come out. Rosalind, 15 that spring, was left with the house, the land, a debt she did not yet know existed, and a grief so total that for weeks she moved through her chores like a sleepwalker, feeding chickens and drawing water because her hands remembered how even when her mind could not hold a single clear thought. It was into this grief that Elias Pruitt stepped, gently at first, offering to help settle her father's affairs, offering to hold the deed papers safe while she mourned, offering, he said, only kindness to a girl too young to manage a homestead alone. Rosalind, trusting because she had been raised to trust, signed what he placed before her without reading every line, believing it to be a temporary guardianship, a formality required by county law for a minor without living parents. It was, in fact, a transfer of the land itself, structured around a debt her father had never truly owed, a debt Pruitt had quietly purchased from a distant creditor for pennies on the dollar the previous autumn, anticipating exactly this outcome. By the time Rosalind understood what she had signed, the papers were filed at the county courthouse in her name no longer, and Judge Abner Whitcomb, a man not unkind but bound by the letter of the documents before him, told her with evident discomfort that he could find no legal fault in the transaction, however it might sit uneasily with him personally. The fall, once it began in earnest, did not happen all at once, and this made it crueler, for Rosalind was permitted false hope at nearly every turn. Pruitt allowed her to remain in the house through the spring planting, calling her a niece under his protection, and for a few weeks she believed perhaps some arrangement might yet be reached, that the land might in time be restored to her, or that she might at least be permitted to stay and work it as her own. Instead, Pruitt's son Vernal, a young man of 20 with his father's flat assessing eyes and none of his father's patience for appearances, began bringing surveyors onto the property, speaking openly of dividing the acreage to sell alongside his own future holdings. Rosalind appealed to Reverend Sooner, who spoke to the judge on her behalf, and to Mabel Ostrander, who offered what small material help she could, but the documents were the documents, and the frontier, for all its talk of honest dealing, had precious little sympathy in its courts for a girl without a signature of her own to counter another's. There were betrayals smaller and more personal than the legal one, and these wounded Rosalind in ways the loss of land alone could not. A hired hand who had worked beside her father for 3 seasons, a man named Otis Cray, sided quickly with Pruitt once wages were mentioned, and spoke of Rosalind afterward in town as an ungrateful girl making trouble over what was rightfully settled. A cousin of her mother's whom Rosalind had never met, but who surfaced briefly at the edge of the dispute, a woman who might have offered testimony about the family's history, declined to become involved, citing a fear of crossing the Pruitts, whose influence extended through half the county's mortgages. Worse than any of this was the slow, grinding social erosion that followed. The way neighbors who had once accepted Martha's help without a second thought now found reasons not to meet Rosalind's eye at church, not because they believed her dishonest, but because taking her side meant risking Pruitt's considerable displeasure, and displeasure from a man who held so many notes on so many farms was not a thing lightly courted. There was a particular afternoon in late July that Rosalind would carry with her for the rest of her life as the moment she understood, fully and without any remaining illusion, exactly how alone she had become. She had walked to the county seat at Vernal Pruitt's insistence to sign a final accounting of the estate, a document she no longer had any power to refuse, and on her way back along the dusty road, she passed the schoolhouse, where she had once recited her letters beside children who now would not meet her eye across a church pew. A knot of them stood at the fence rail, and one boy, emboldened perhaps by something he had overheard at his own family's supper table, called out that the Calloway girl had gotten exactly what came of trusting kin who owed her nothing, a cruelty small in itself, but devastating in what it revealed, that the town's sympathy, however genuinely felt by individuals like Mabel or the Reverend, had already begun to calcify into the comfortable story that nothing improper had truly occurred, that a signature was a signature, and that a 15-year-old girl's grief was simply grief and not evidence of anything owed to her. Rosalind did not cry until she was well past the schoolhouse and out of sight of the road, and when she did, she found that the tears came not for the land itself, which she was beginning to understand she might never recover, but for the quiet, sinking certainty that the version of herself who had once believed decency was simply how the world worked was a girl she would not get back. By midsummer, Rosalind was sleeping in Mabel Ostrander's storeroom above the dry goods shop, having been told by Vernal Pruitt that her presence in the house was no longer required now that the surveying was complete. She took in mending and helped Mabel with the store's accounts in exchange for her narrow cot and her meals, and she watched, with a grief that had by now hardened into something quieter and more resolute than despair, as strangers began walking the fields her father had broken with his own hands. It was Elias Pruitt himself, in a final act that Rosalind would remember with particular clarity for the rest of her life, who came to the storeroom one September evening, ostensibly to settle what he called a final kindness, and pressed into her hand the $11.40 that remained from the sale of her mother's few pieces of jewelry, informing her without any visible discomfort, that the account was now closed between them, and that she ought to consider herself fortunate he had troubled himself at all given how little legal obligation he bore her. Rosalind took the money because she had no choice, sewed it into the lining of her mother's coat that same night, and understood, with the particular clarity grief sometimes grants, that she was now entirely alone in the world, 15 years old, with nothing to her name but a coat, a Bible, a photograph, and a sum of money that would not last the winter. She left Ashwell County proper in early October, walking the first several miles before a passing freight wagon carried her the rest of the distance to Millhaven Bend, a town she chose less for any particular promise it held than because it was the largest settlement within walking distance that was not controlled, in any direct sense, by the Pruitt family's web of debts and favors. Millhaven Bend sat where a wide, lazy curve of the Solomon River met the old cattle trail, a town of perhaps 600 souls with a courthouse square, 3 churches, a schoolhouse, a newspaper of uneven quality called the Millhaven Sentinel, and a scattering of homesteads fanning outward into the surrounding grassland, several of which had failed and stood empty, waiting either for new owners or for the prairie to reclaim them entirely. It was in the second week of October, on a bright, cold Saturday with frost still silvering the shadowed grass by mid-morning, that Rosalind first heard of the county tax auction to be held on the courthouse steps, a semi-annual event in which properties whose owners had abandoned them or fallen too far behind on taxes to redeem them were sold to the highest bidder for whatever sum would clear the debt owed the county. Mabel had mentioned it only in passing, as an oddity of local life, and Rosalind might have thought nothing further of it had she not. Walking the edge of town 2 days later on an errand to deliver mended linens, passed within sight of a derelict homestead a mile beyond the last regular street, its house long since collapsed into its own cellar hole, its fences swallowed by sumac and switchgrass, and rising above the ruin, canted at an angle that seemed to defy the wind rather than harness it. A windmill of considerable age and evident craftsmanship, its sails long broken, its tower silvered gray, standing like the last honest bone of something that had once been whole. Rosalind stopped in the road and looked at it for a long while. She could not have said, then, why the sight moved her as it did, only that something in the proportions of it, the careful joinery still visible even in ruin, the deliberate way its tower had been raised on the town's highest ground to best catch the prevailing wind, spoke to her of a builder who had understood exactly what her father had only dreamed of understanding. She asked Mabel that evening who had owned the place, and Mabel, frowning in the effort of memory, said only that it had belonged to a German family named Hausmann, millers by trade, who had come to Millhaven Bend in the earliest days of the town's founding and had left it, quite suddenly and without much explanation that anyone in town could still recall, some 11 or 12 years past, around the time Rosalind herself had been a small child. No one in Millhaven Bend, Mabel added, seemed entirely certain why the Hausmanns had gone, though there had been talk once, long faded now, of a family quarrel, or perhaps a debt, or perhaps simply the ordinary grief of the prairie, which took families as often as it made them. The tax auction was held 8 days later on the courthouse steps, a modest affair attended by perhaps 30 townspeople more for entertainment than genuine interest, since most of the parcels on offer were poor land or ruined structures unlikely to fetch serious bids. Judge Whitcomb himself presided as auctioneer, reading each parcel's description in a flat, official voice, and when he came to the old Hausmann homestead, describing it as 40 acres of neglected grassland with a collapsed dwelling and, he noted almost as an afterthought, a windmill structure of no determined value, there was a ripple of quiet laughter among the onlookers, several of whom called out jesting remarks about buying the wind itself. Rosalind, standing at the back of the small crowd in her mother's coat, felt her heart move in a way she did not entirely understand, and before she had fully decided to speak, she heard her own voice offering $3, the opening bid the judge required. No one else bid against her. The parcel was, by any sensible measure, worthless, 40 acres too far from good water to farm easily, and a windmill too far gone to repair, without money no sane investor believed the site would ever justify. The gavel came down at $3.20, and Rosalind Calloway, 15 years old, an orphan with no family and no home, became the owner of a crumbling windmill on an abandoned Kansas homestead, to the mild, indulgent amusement of the entire town of Millhaven Bend, several of whom remarked to one another, not unkindly, but not entirely kindly either, that grief did strange things to a person's judgment. She walked out to the property the following morning, alone, carrying a lantern, a hatchet for clearing brush, and a lunch of bread and cold bacon wrapped in cloth. The house foundation was little more than a stone-lined depression choked with thistle, and Rosalind spent an hour simply clearing a path to the windmill's base, cutting back sumac that had grown up thick as a man's wrist around the tower's stone footing. The tower itself, once she reached it, proved sturdier than its outward decay suggested. The stonework at its base was dry-laid but tight, clearly the work of a mason who had understood his trade, and the heavy timber frame above, though weathered silver gray and hung with old wasp paper, still stood true and plumb against the sky. The door into the tower's ground floor hung on one hinge, and inside, Rosalind found the abandoned machinery of milling, grindstones gone green with lichen, a hopper collapsed in on itself, gears rusted into stillness, and the particular hollow, resonant quiet of a space that had once been full of purposeful noise and had stood silent for over a decade. It was on her third visit to the property, having spent the intervening days at Mabel's store earning what small coin she could while thinking of little else but the windmill, that Rosalind discovered the ladder. It was set into the inner wall of the tower, half hidden behind a fallen section of grindstone housing, its rungs still solid despite their age. Climbing upward past the main milling floor into the darkness of the tower's upper reaches, toward what she had assumed, from the outside, was simply the cap and sail mechanism. She climbed it slowly, testing each rung, her lantern held awkwardly in one hand, and near the top, tucked beneath the tower's peaked cap, where the great central shaft had once turned the sails, she found something she had not expected at all, a small loft, no more than 8 feet across, boarded in on 3 sides with milled lumber far finer than the rough materials used elsewhere in the tower's construction. Clearly a space built with deliberate care and, more strikingly, built to be hidden. Its low door disguised behind what appeared from the milling floor to be simply another section of aging wall paneling. Before she found the loft itself, Rosalind spent the better part of an hour simply standing amid the ruined milling floor, running her palm along the great wooden gears as her father had once taught her to read the grain and wear of good timber, and she found herself talking aloud to the empty tower in a way that would have embarrassed her had anyone been present to hear it, telling the abandoned machinery, in a voice not unlike the one her mother had used over a sickbed, that she meant to see it turning again someday, whatever it cost her. It was this same careful, respectful attention, the habit of a girl raised to see worth in things others had discarded, that led her eventually to notice the ladder at all, for a less patient visitor might easily have taken the tower's evident ruin at face value and left without ever climbing higher than the silent grindstones. Inside the loft, coated in a decade of dust but otherwise remarkably preserved by the tight, dry construction that had kept out both weather and vermin, Rosalind found a narrow cot frame, a small writing desk built into the wall itself, and a wooden chest bound in iron, its lock long since rusted but not, she found when she pried at it with her hatchet, entirely beyond opening. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a leather ledger book, a small oil painting of a river scene rolled loosely in oilcloth, and, resting on top of everything else as though placed there last, and with particular care, a woman's silver locket on a broken chain. Rosalind opened the locket first. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest, and found inside 2 small portraits, faded but unmistakably rendered, of 2 young girls who could not have been more than 8 and 10 years old, dressed in the plain good clothes of a modest, respectable family, their features so achingly familiar that Rosalind sat back hard against the loft wall, her lantern light trembling across the aged wood, because one of those 2 small faces, she was nearly certain even, in that first stunned moment, bore the unmistakable set of the eyes and the particular curve of the chin that she had seen every day of her childhood in her own mother's face across the breakfast table. She did not open the letters that first evening. It grew too dark to read safely by lantern alone in a rickety tower a mile from town, and some instinct, Some sensed that this discovery deserved more care than a rushed, trembling reading in fading light. Made her wrap the locket carefully in her handkerchief, tuck it into her coat pocket beside her father's photograph, and climb back down the ladder into the ordinary dusk, leaving the chest closed but not locked. The loft's hidden door pulled shut behind her. She walked back to town with her mind racing through a dozen impossible questions at once. Why would a Houseman family locket contain a portrait so similar to her own mother's face? Why would anyone build so careful and hidden a space at the very top of a working windmill? A space clearly meant for privacy, perhaps even for concealment. And why, above all, had her mother Martha Calloway, who claimed to have no family left in all the world, never once mentioned the name Houseman, nor spoken of any connection whatsoever to the small, struggling town of Millhaven Bend, where Rosalind now found herself standing, quite by accident and quite by poverty, on the very ground her mother's people might once have called home. There were false leads in those first days that led nowhere, and Rosalind would later say that the mystery taught her as much through its dead ends as through its answers. She spent one entire afternoon convinced that a set of scratched marks on the loft's inner wall formed some manner of cipher, only to realize, tracing them by daylight, that they were nothing more than a child's careless measuring marks, notches cut perhaps to record a girl's growing height against the timber, a detail that moved her nearly as much as any true clue once she understood its ordinary tenderness. She likewise spent a full day chasing the assumption that the painted river scene must conceal something behind its canvas, prying gently at its backing with a fingernail before Mabel, examining it more carefully, pointed out that the frame itself was of a common, mass-produced variety sold by mail-order catalogs throughout the territory, and that whatever the painting's secret proved to be, it would not be found in its ordinary wooden frame. These small failures cost her time and no small measure of frustration, yet each one narrowed her sense of the family she was uncovering, teaching her that the Housemans had been neither wealthy nor given to elaborate concealment for its own sake, but plain, careful people who hid what mattered most in the ordinary places a working family actually used. A lesson that would prove essential when at last she turned her attention to the desk built into the loft's own wall. Sarah Tillman was the first person Rosalind told, 2 evenings later. Sitting on the back step of the Tillman bakery with the locket between them, catching the last orange light of sunset. Sarah, practical and steady where Rosalind was still reeling, suggested what seemed the obvious next step. Someone in Millhaven Bend must remember the Houseman family well enough to say whether Martha had been among their number, and if so, why she had vanished so completely from both the family and the town's memory. It was Reverend Sooner, consulted the following Sunday after service, who provided the first real thread to pull. He recalled, he said, slowly, as though drawing the memory up from some deep well, that Frederick Houseman, the family patriarch and the Windmill's builder, had indeed had 2 daughters, though the Reverend had come to Millhaven Bend only shortly before the family's departure and had known them mostly by sight. One daughter, he believed, had married and moved away some years before the family's final exit from town, a departure that had struck the Reverend at the time as unusually final for a family so rooted in the community. No farewell gathering, no forwarding word, simply a wagon loaded in the gray hour before dawn and gone. The other daughter, younger, had remained with her parents until the family left Millhaven Bend entirely, and of her fate the Reverend knew nothing further, only that the whole Houseman name had simply ceased to be spoken in town not long after, as though some understanding had passed silently among the townsfolk that the subject was better left alone. This account, incomplete as it was, sent Rosalind back to the chest and its bundle of letters with a new and urgent purpose. Over the following week, working by lantern light in the loft itself on evenings when she could steal away from her duties at Mabel's store, and later at a small table Mabel allowed her in the storeroom, Rosalind read through the letters one by one, and the story they told, pieced together across nearly 24 separate pages written in at least 3 different hands, began to take a shape both more tender and more troubling than she had imagined. Frederick Houseman, it emerged, had built the windmill not merely as a business but as a kind of covenant with the town, grinding grain for struggling homesteaders at reduced rates or on credit through hard years, and had been, by every account the letters offered, a man of considerable local respect. But the letters also spoke, in careful, guarded language, of a mounting dispute over water rights and mill fees with a neighboring landholder identified only as EP, a dispute that had grown, across several letters spanning perhaps 2 years, from polite disagreement into something the family clearly regarded as a genuine and escalating threat. One letter in particular, written in Frederick Houseman's own hand and addressed, it seemed, to himself or perhaps intended as a private record rather than true correspondence, described a night when EP and several hired men had come to the mill under cover of darkness and damaged the sale mechanism, an act Frederick attributed directly to his refusal to sell the mill and surrounding water rights at a price he considered a swindle. Another letter, this one in a woman's hand that Rosalind would come to recognize, with growing certainty, as her own grandmother Greta Houseman's, spoke with aching plainness of a decision the family had reached to send their elder daughter away to relatives in another territory, to protect her, the letter said, from threats that had begun to be made not merely against the mill but against the family itself. Threats delivered obliquely through ruined crops, poisoned wells, and once, most chillingly, a note left nailed to the mill's door that the letter did not quote directly, but described only as containing words no decent person ought to have to read twice. The elder daughter's name, given at last in that letter with a tenderness that made Rosalind's hands shake as she read it, was Martha. Rosalind sat with that single word, that single confirmed name, for a long while before she could bring herself to read further. Her mother had been sent away from Millhaven Bend as a girl, perhaps 16 or 17, to protect her from a campaign of intimidation waged by a man identified only by initials that matched, with a coincidence too precise to be coincidence at all, those of Elias Pruitt. The ledger book in the chest, once Rosalind turned to it, confirmed and deepened this discovery further still, recording not merely the mill's ordinary business, but a series of loans extended by Elias Pruitt to Frederick Houseman during a lean season. Loans that the ledger's later entries suggested had been called due with unusual and calculated haste, precisely timed, it appeared, to a season when a hailstorm had ruined the county's wheat and left every miller and farmer for miles in a state of desperate vulnerability. The pattern, laid bare across the ledger's neat columns, was unmistakable to Rosalind now that she understood what she was looking for, because it was the very same pattern that had cost her, 15 years later and 40 miles distant, her own father's land, a debt purchased or extended at the moment of greatest weakness, called due at the moment of greatest leverage, and a family, in the end, either driven off or dispossessed entirely. The oil painting, when Rosalind finally unrolled it fully by daylight, showed a river scene she did not at first recognize, but which Mabel Ostrander, shown the painting during a quiet moment at the store, identified immediately as a bend of the Solomon River just north of town, a spot locally called Miller's Bend, precisely because, Mabel explained, it was where old Frederick Houseman had first staked his claim decades before, and where, before he built the great windmill on the higher ground, he had operated a smaller water-driven mill now long since washed away in a spring flood. This detail, seemingly minor, would prove crucial in the story's final unraveling, for the painting's reverse side bore a faint, penciled inscription in Frederick Houseman's own careful hand, a short note addressed to no one in particular, reading simply that whatever befell the family, the true deed to the original Miller's Bend claim, predating and superseding any paper EP might hold or forge, lay safe where only blood would think to look. Rosalind read this line perhaps a dozen times before its meaning began to settle into her, understanding slowly, with a mixture of astonishment and dawning purpose, that somewhere on or near this ruined property lay a document that might not merely tell her family's history, but might legally overturn whatever claim Elias Pruitt or his descendants believed they held to land in the vicinity, a possibility that would matter more than Rosalind could yet imagine, given how very near Pruitt's own Eastern holdings actually lay to the old Miller's Bend claim. There remained, however, the deeper and more personal mystery still unresolved. What had become of Martha's younger sister, the second girl in the Lockett's twin portraits, the one who had remained with the family until its final, unexplained departure from Millhaven Bend some years after Martha had already been sent away? The letters offered no name for her directly in the passages Rosalind had so far deciphered, several pages having been damaged by damp or eaten away at the edges by insects over the long years of neglect. And it was this unanswered question, more than the tantalizing hint of a superior deed, that drove Rosalind back again and again to the loft, reading each surviving fragment with painstaking care, searching for the name of an aunt she had never known she possessed, and wondering, with a hope she hardly dared allow herself, whether that sister might yet be living, and if living, whether she might be found. It was in the third week of her search, deep into the tangled genealogy the letters slowly revealed, that Rosalind found the fragment that named her. A torn half-page, water-stained but legible, written in Greta Hausmann's hand and dated some months after Martha's departure, spoke of the family's decision to keep their younger daughter, Iris, closer at hand, entrusted for her safety to the household of a trusted family friend on the far side of the county under a changed surname, so that no searching eye connected to EP's ongoing campaign of pressure might trace her. The friend's name, and the surname under which young Iris Hausmann had been placed, was rendered in the letter only as Dunmore. Rosalind sat utterly still when she read this, because Dunmore was not, to her, an unfamiliar name at all. It belonged, she realized with a shock that seemed to travel the length of her spine, to a quiet, elderly widow who kept a modest but well-tended house at the far eastern edge of Millhaven Bend, and who was known throughout town, in the ordinary, unremarkable way of small settlements, simply as Widow Dunmore, a woman who took in sewing, attended the same small Methodist church as Reverend Sooner, and who had, on more than one occasion since Rosalind's arrival in town, offered the strange, unaccountable girl with the windmill a kind word and, once, a jar of preserved plums, for reasons Rosalind had assumed at the time to be nothing more than ordinary neighborly warmth. Among the letters, tucked between 2 pages describing an ordinary autumn harvest, Rosalind also found a shorter note in a child's careful, uneven hand, clearly written by young Iris herself in the months before the family's final departure, addressed simply to her older sister with no expectation, it seemed, of ever being sent. It spoke, in the plain, unguarded language of a frightened child trying to sound brave, of how quiet the house had become since Martha left, how their father had taken to sleeping in the mill itself some nights with a shotgun across his knees, and how their mother had begun teaching Iris the same careful stitch she had once taught Martha, the miller's knot, saying that a girl ought to have something of her own hands to hold onto no matter what else might be taken from her. Reading it, Rosalind understood at last why her own mother had known that same small piece of needlework, passed down not through comfortable years of settled domestic life, but through fear and hurried parting, a fragment of ordinary tenderness carried out of a house under siege, and she found herself weeping quietly over the ledger's spine, grieving now not only for the parents she had lost, but for 2 little girls, decades before her, who had been forced to grow up too quickly under a threat. Neither of them fully understood. Rosalind did not go to the widow's door immediately. She understood, with an instinct that felt older than her 15 years, that such a revelation could not simply be blurted across a threshold, that a woman who had spent perhaps 40 years living quietly under a changed name to escape a danger she likely still remembered vividly deserved to be approached with the same care that had once protected her. Instead, Rosalind spent several more days gathering every remaining thread the chest could offer, cross-referencing dates in the ledger against the letters, confirming through the county recorder's dusty older volumes, which Judge Whitcomb himself, growing quietly and genuinely curious about the young woman's persistent research, helped her locate that a Frederick Hausman had indeed filed an original claim at Miller's Bend a full 4 years before any Pruitt land patent in the same district. A discrepancy in the public record that, if the elder deed Frederick's painting note referenced could actually be produced, would carry very real legal weight indeed. It was around this same time that word of Rosalind's activities, inevitably, in a town the size of Millhaven Bend, began to travel, and it traveled, as such things do, eventually and unhappily all the way east to Ashwell County, and the ears of Elias Pruitt himself, who arrived in Millhaven Bend on a raw, windy afternoon in early November, ostensibly on unrelated business, but who made a point, within his first day in town, of calling upon Judge Whitcomb to inquire, with studied casualness, into the nature of certain old records the judge had recently been asked to pull. Rosalind learned of this visit from Sarah Tillman, whose father's bakery sat directly across from the courthouse, and who had watched Pruitt's unmistakable lean figure cross the square with an expression Sarah described, with some alarm, as a man walking toward a fire he intended to put out by any means necessary. Pruitt's opposition, once it began in earnest, proved swift and considerably more sophisticated than Rosalind had feared. He did not, at first, confront her directly. Instead, he began quietly purchasing what small debts existed against Mabel Ostrander's store, a maneuver so plainly intended to pressure Rosalind's one reliable ally into withdrawing her support that Mabel herself recognized it within days and, rather than yielding, marched directly to Reverend Sooner's parsonage to warn him what was coming. Pruitt next approached Judge Whitcomb with a carefully worded suggestion that the old Houseman property auction might be subject to legal challenge on the grounds that a minor without a proper guardian ought never to have been permitted to bid at all, a technicality that, if pursued formally, threatened to strip Rosalind of the Windmill and its hidden loft entirely before she could ever produce whatever elder deed the oil painting's inscription promised existed. And when these quieter maneuvers failed to produce the swift capitulation Pruitt seemed to expect, he resorted at last to something closer to his original methods. On a moonless night in the second week of November, someone set fire to the dry grass along the Windmill property's southern edge, a blaze that, had the wind shifted only slightly, might well have consumed the tower itself and everything hidden within it, and which was extinguished only through the frantic, soot-blackened efforts of Rosalind herself, together with Sarah Tillman, Reverend Sooner, and several other townspeople roused by the smell of smoke on the night air, who beat the flames back with wet sacking and shovel-turned earth until the fire guttered and died within 20 feet of the tower's stone base. In the tense days between the fire and the town's slow turning of conscience, Pruitt made one further attempt to end the matter quietly, arriving unannounced at Mabel's storeroom with an offer he framed as generous. A sum of $200, considerable money by any homesteader's reckoning, in exchange for Rosalind's signature relinquishing all claim to the Windmill property and agreeing never to raise the matter of the old Houseman land again. He spoke to her the way he had once spoken to a grieving 15-year-old on a smoke-stained porch, gently, reasonably, as though he were offering mercy rather than demanding surrender, and for one brief, exhausted moment, with Mabel's shop bell silent behind them and winter pressing cold against the windows, Rosalind felt the old childhood habit of trusting an elder's kindness rise up in her again. But she thought of the locket in her pocket, of Iris weeping in her small house at the edge of town, of her father's unbuilt windmill and her mother's unspoken grief, and she told Elias Pruitt, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had already lost one inheritance to a signature she had not understood, and that she would not sign away a second. Pruitt's expression did not change, but something in his bearing did, a subtle stiffening that told Rosalind, more clearly than any words could have, that the offer had been the last gentle instrument he intended to use, and that whatever came next would not pretend at kindness. That fire, rather than frightening Millhaven Bend into silence, seemed instead to crack something open in the town's collective conscience. Too many people had now stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, beating out flames meant to destroy a 15-year-old orphan's one possession in the world, and the plain, undeniable evidence of deliberate arson, together with the accumulating whispers of Pruitt's older history with the Houseman family, began to shift public sentiment in Millhaven Bend in a way that money and influence alone could not entirely suppress. Reverend Sooner preached that Sunday, without naming names directly, but with a pointedness no one in the congregation mistook, on the parable of the vineyard wrongfully seized, and several long-time residents, moved by the sermon and by their own uneasy memories of the Houseman family's abrupt and unexplained departure so many years before, began at last to speak openly of what they recalled, adding fragment after fragment to the picture Rosalind was assembling, until the community that had once regarded her windmill purchase as an act of foolish grief began instead to regard it as something closer to an unfinished reckoning the whole town had, in its way, been complicit in avoiding for over a decade. It was Widow Dunmore herself, in the end, who came to Rosalind, arriving at Mabel's storeroom on a gray afternoon with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who had rehearsed a difficult conversation many times in her own mind before finally permitting herself to have it aloud. She had heard, she said, simply and without preamble, that a young woman had bought the old Houseman mill, and that this young woman had lately been asking questions around town that only a very particular kind of knowledge could have prompted. She asked, then, with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her eyes fixed somewhere just past Rosalind's shoulder, whether Rosalind's mother's name had perhaps been Martha. When Rosalind, her own hands trembling, produced the locket from her coat pocket and opened it to show the two small painted faces within, Widow Dunmore, who had lived 40 years under a borrowed surname precisely to escape the danger that Locket's very existence represented, put both hands over her mouth and wept, quietly and completely, for a very long time before she could speak again, and when at last she did speak, it was only to say that she had wondered, every single day for 11 years, what had ever become of her sister, and had never once dared to write and ask, for fear of what such a letter might bring down upon them both. The reunion between Rosalind and her great-aunt, for Iris Dunmore was indeed her mother's younger sister, and thus Rosalind's own great-aunt by blood, though the years and the danger had made her more like a lost grandmother in spirit, unfolded over the following days in long, tearful conversations that filled in at last the shape of everything the letters had only sketched. Iris confirmed the family's flight from Elias Pruitt's escalating campaign of intimidation, confirmed that Martha had been sent away first for her safety and had, in a bitter irony neither woman had ever known to grieve properly, settled far enough from Millhaven Bend to believe herself entirely safe, never suspecting that the very same man's family would, a full generation later, visit an almost identical ruin upon her own daughter. Iris also confirmed, with a clarity that would prove essential in the conflict still to come, that her father Frederick had indeed spoken to her, in his final year before his heart gave out in the small rented rooms the family took after leaving Millhaven Bend, of an original deed to the Miller's Bend claim, a document predating any paper Pruitt held, which Frederick had hidden, he told her, somewhere only a houseman would think to search, in the one place he had built with his own hands to outlast every threat made against his family, the Windmill's hidden loft itself. Armed now with Iris's testimony, and with Judge Whitcomb's own growing conviction that the matter deserved formal legal scrutiny rather than quiet dismissal, Rosalind returned to the loft with fresh eyes and a fresh understanding of what she was truly searching for. She had, in her earlier explorations, examined the writing desk built into the loft's wall only in passing, assuming it empty. Now, running her fingers carefully along its underside as her father had once taught her to check for hidden catches in old furniture, she found a shallow recessed panel, cleverly fitted flush with the desk's construction, which sprang open at the pressure of her thumb to reveal a single oilcloth-wrapped packet that had lain undisturbed for over a decade. Within it, remarkably preserved by the same careful dry construction that had protected everything else in the loft, lay the original 1868 claim document for the Miller's Bend parcel, bearing Frederick Houseman's signature and an official territorial recording stamp 4 full years earlier than the date on record for the competing Pruitt patent that Elias's own grandfather had filed over what had, in fact, already been legally claimed ground. Elias Pruitt did not yield easily even when confronted, in Judge Whitcomb's own chambers, with the elder deed, the ledger's damning record of predatory loans, Iris Dunmore's sworn testimony, and the recorder's own confirmed dates. He argued technicalities, disputed the document's authenticity, and even attempted, in a final and rather desperate maneuver, to suggest that the fire set at the windmill's edge had been an accident of nature rather than his own hired doing, a claim undermined within days when one of the men he had paid to set it, racked by guilt after nearly watching a young woman burn for his employer's greed, came forward to Reverend Sooner and, through him, to the judge, with a full confession. Faced with the accumulated weight of deed, ledger, testimony, and confession, and with the whole town of Millhaven Bend now watching the proceedings with an attention no amount of influence could entirely suppress, Elias Pruitt's claim to the disputed acreage collapsed, and with it collapsed, in the eyes of nearly everyone who had once deferred to him out of fear of his mortgages and his temper, a great deal of the quiet authority he had spent decades accumulating. The restoration that followed was not, in the end, primarily a matter of land or money. Though both were rightfully returned to Rosalind and to Iris Dunmore in the settlement, Judge Whitcomb ultimately approved. The Millers' Bend acreage reverting to the Houseman line under the elder deed's clear priority, and a portion of Pruitt's own eastern holdings, shown to have been built in part upon profits from the predatory loans documented in the ledger, ordered returned as restitution both to Rosalind for her father's stolen homestead and to the wider community of smaller farmers who had, it emerged once records were properly examined, suffered similar, if less dramatic squeezes from Pruitt's lending practices across the years. What mattered far more to Rosalind, standing at last on the courthouse steps where she had once bid $3.20 for a ruin no one else wanted, was the sight of Iris Dunmore beside her, no longer a solitary widow keeping a careful, hidden distance from town affairs, but a woman restored to her own name and her own history, weeping openly now not from fear, but from a joy so long deferred it had nearly been forgotten how to feel. Rosalind used a portion of the restored funds, in the weeks that followed, to repair the windmill's sails and mechanism, engaging a millwright from Salina to restore the great turning wheel to working order, and by the following spring the mill that Frederick Houseman had built as a covenant with his community was grinding grain once again, offered, at Rosalind's own insistence and in clear echo of her grandfather's original practice, at reduced rates to any homesteader in Millhaven Bend, struggling through a hard season. The windmill still stands, as it stood on that first frost-bright morning when a girl with almost nothing left walked toward it not knowing what she carried the seed of, its sails turning now in steady, well-oiled rhythm against the wide Kansas sky, and it has become, in the years since, less a monument to loss than a living answer to it. Rosalind Calloway, who arrived in Millhaven Bend with $11.40 and a coat lined with grief, found there not merely a fortune in overlooked timber and stone, but the family her mother had been forced to abandon in order to protect her, a great aunt who taught her, in the quiet months that followed, the recipes and the small domestic wisdoms Martha herself had never had the chance to pass fully down, and a town that learned, through her patient unearthing of an old and buried wrong, that the debts owed by one generation do not simply vanish with time, but wait, as Frederick Houseman's hidden deed had waited, for someone with the courage to look for them in the one place everyone else had assumed held nothing worth finding. The windmill's turning sails, visible now from nearly every corner of Millhaven Bend, have become in local memory a kind of quiet promise that overlooked things and overlooked people alike may yet hold, folded away in some hidden loft of themselves, a worth no one thought to look for, and a name, once erased, that only patience and love could recover and speak aloud again. Thank you, truly, for spending this evening with us and with Rosalind's story. If tales of hidden legacies, quiet resilience, and long overdue justice speak to something in you, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a comment telling us which part moved you most, and subscribe so you never miss the next story we have to tell. We would love to know, before you go, is there a forgotten corner of your own family's history you have always wondered about? And if given the chance, would you go looking for what it might still be hiding? Until next time, stay close.